This image is from 450 BC, and it's of a Greek city, and really it's to show that the Greeks were the first in our cultural tradition to plan cities. And what they did was they put a grid down onto a piece of land, and then it became interesting through the use of topography. So the topography here you can see is the sea around the city and some of the hillsides and some of the shape of the coastline that create public spaces, an amphitheatre at the edge of the water, and interest that continues through a European tradition until we get to the foundation of Cork and how it developed on its own topography, which I'll be talking about. This is the Villa Barbaro, so I'm jumping up to the Renaissance, and this is Villa Barbaro by Palladio. It's in the Venetian state, and you can see the symmetry and the classicism as expressed by Palladio. And Palladio's ideas were taken on board in Northern Europe in what was our Renaissance in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. And of course, here's a house in Kinsale overlooking the water, and although it's had quite the alteration, you can see that in the 18th century, almost everything built in Ireland was built in the Palladian tradition. Every house, every large house, every small house, every part of it. And then again, we started to build our cities in this tradition as well. So here's a guy in Rome. It's from the Johnstone Museum, who's actually measuring classical pieces. That's a composite capital in Rome. And then you have a Doric capital here. So what happened was people like this measured things, and then books were created. And the books then were published in a widespread manner. I mean, you can relate this back to the Gutenberg printing press. We were able to get these things, and as a young country, we had patterns of houses, patterns of classical detail, and we took it on board, I think beyond any other country in Northern Europe, and said, we're going to produce this Palladian world, and we did. So this is the 4 books on architecture by Palladio. I'm going to go a little bit fast now because I wanted to see this door. This is in the centre of Cork, and of course joinery in Cork hit a fine level of detail that is beyond any other country that I've ever seen. This is a door on the North Mall, and it's been restored recently, and it would have been created from these pattern books. And it's one of the reasons it's extremely delicate is not just because of the evolution of joinery in the city, which of course was very important, but also because the Napoleonic Wars meant that we didn't have materials, so timber was very precious, and when a material becomes precious, then you start to really think about how you use it. And then stonemasonry in Cork as well. There are many, many books written about it, and we have this incredible limestone that is hard enough to hold its detail, but soft enough to carve. Few cities have that. It's as close as you'll get to, say, a Venetian limestone as you'll find in Europe, and of course it's got that distinctive white, pale grey colour. So this is in Venice, and I keep having to reference the name of this. Is San Giovanni Nuovo, this church on the left, and I found it one day when I was in Venice, and I'm just fascinated by how it was built as a brick box and then clad in stone. And of course our own Holy Trinity was built in exactly the same way. So you can see that the tradition from the southern Renaissance, which moved up into Northern Europe and then into Cork, is a 1,000-year tradition of building techniques, and I think the 2 slides demonstrate that very well. This is the Exchange in Cork, and I just put up this image because it's such a fine classical building, but in an early Renaissance form and tradition, and I'll come back to it again. But you can see how simple the public buildings are. On the left there you have shops and houses, and then you have this exchange, which was like a market. And the exchange uses very particular materials and very particular classical detail to say, I am a public building. So we're following the rules in Cork that were established by the Greeks, further established by the Romans, moved up through the continent, and then we're here, and we said, wow, we're going to get these rules right, and we're going to do them really, really, really well, because we're a young country.
That's in Cork.
In Cork.
That was in Cork.
That was in Cork. It's gone now, but it was on Castle Street, where Castle Street is. It was knocked down, and then the function was moved to the Imperial Hotel, I think it was, I'm not sure when it was knocked down, but it would have been probably in the early 19th century, very early. So here we have Florence and Cork, and the comparison is obvious. The way in which we even described our cities was the same. The public buildings have the blue roofs, and then the ordinary buildings within the city have the red roofs. So you're going back to, I'm not sure the exact date of that. I think it's 1493 for Florence, and then it's later for Cork. I'll confirm that later if anyone wants to know the exact date. And this is the Nolly map of Rome, and also a 19th century map of Cork. And what's interesting is that the public buildings are shown as public space within the map. So you can actually see into the public buildings. You can see the Opera House down on the bottom of the lower map there, and then you can see the Firkin Crane up there on the upper left hand. And I always get that mixed up with the Pantheon in Rome, which you can see in the map of Rome up above. So you can see that the tradition of creating streets and space and public buildings that overlook the streets and the spaces is running all the way through Europe in the same way. And of course this is John Butt's painting of Cork from I think it's the late 18th century. It's in the Crawford Gallery, and you can see it expresses very much the Northern European tradition by which Cork was developed. So you see the river, you see the canals coming into the river, and you see the quite Dutch expression of the architecture. So I want to use this to show that trade in Cork was with Northern Europe. Ideas came from Northern Europe, and then of course from the south of England as well. And the similarities between this kind of Northern Renaissance of trade and over to America as well with some of our goods created an architecture that was very rich, but very particularly 18th century. And it was our boom time really up until the mid-19th century. This is a print that's in the British Library, and it shows Cork. Particularly interesting for me is that what you see behind the wall there, that's looking down to Loch Mahon, and that is what we call the Marina Dockland area now. So it was fully water at one stage. This is George on the horse in the Grand Parade, and you can see Parliament Bridge on the right. And it's great to see that view and Parliament Bridge are still standing so well today. Down below you have Covent Garden, and Covent Garden had, in the 1960s, was proposed to have a lot of the historic architecture removed. It was one of the earliest planned spaces in London, classical spaces. Inigo Jones designed the church. He was interestingly created to or linked to the Queen of Denmark at the time, and he had a lot of patronage. And London was to lose this space. I think they set up a community association for Covent Garden at the time, which was sponsored by a local politician who was Princess Diana's wicked step-mother, I think, who actually put her time and effort into solving this. And London wouldn't be the same without it. And really the point is, Cork wouldn't be the same without what we have as well. This is a plan from I couldn't read that up there, I think it's 1971 maybe, but this was pre the Lutz plan for Cork, and these are the motorways that were prepared. It was a kind of an inner ring road with a lot of different motorways and slip roads to get off and on. I think my house is gone. I think a lot of places are gone. You can see where it is. It's at the bottom of Summerhill. But people were not happy about this. Particularly young architects were against it. And it was stopped eventually, perhaps due to lack of money, but also by some strong leadership in the city. I think it was Joe McHugh was the city manager at the time, and his role was quite different than the managers now, but he literally said, this is not a good idea, just from public pressure. But you still see the remnants of this around the city because land clearance was done to create this. And so we lost some of the city just by even talking about it. Now this is the South Mall. No, it isn't the South Mall. It's actually the Golden Bend in Amsterdam. And it's a view of the Golden Bend. I think it's in the Rijksmuseum. But you can see here on the left and the right, you have the steps, you have the canal, and you have the water in the middle. And that's exactly how the South Mall would have been. And a lot of our waterways were covered up in the 19th century, but the connection between Northern Europe and how we built our city, at one stage we were building a Dutch city based on canals entirely, and the remnants are very strong. This is John Benson's Athenaeum, which became the Opera House, and really this is to show how public buildings are Palladian and how they say, I'm here, I'm a different scale, I'm a different proportion, and I've got a different series of detailing. But if you look at the connection with the water, this also expresses how important the river was to Cork, and in fact how slow moving the river was, and how we lived on the river for transport, and the delicacy and the gentility of the whole scene I find very intriguing in comparison to the way it is today. And of course we were a trading city. If you look at the names of the people, if you look at the businesses that were set up and the quality, even our Haji Bays and our our Turkish Delight and everything we ever did in Cork had a connection to somebody coming in and teaching us a new thing. So we built our Dutch city, we built our Palladian city, and we traded with the world, and particularly with Northern Europe. And then we built our city at that same time of slate hanging, brick and limestone. And again, you can see the quays there. That's an expression of early 19th century naval architecture, if you like, that kind of building that was being carried out in the great works of engineering. And then you get to the intimacy. Now here's the clearing of building. This is the Northgate Bridge, and as you fed into the medieval city, and the medieval city was built right on the edge of the water, which is usually a characteristic of medieval cities and the rivers running through medieval cities. And it's great to see this still there. But the land was cleared for the motorway that we saw earlier, and so even the idea of a bad plan is something that can be hugely destructive for a city. So when you see a bad plan, you've got to talk about it. You can see actually the bow-fronted buildings which are still on Grand Parade, which are slate hung, which was brought in by the Normans and used in the 18th century, widespread here, also in Somerset and in Devon and Cornwall. And those connections, they're all maritime connections. The sea shanties, you can make all the connections on many, many different levels. The quays here are partly medieval, partly 19th century. There's 19th century on the end of the Grand Parade there, but you go back into Rubblestone as you move deeper into the photograph. I find there's so much information on this, it's mind-blowing and so beautiful. And then here again, this is the Grand Parade, and you can see the flag stone, you can see the hogging on the footpaths, the cobbles on the street, many of them are still there, and the white limestone edges on the edge of the street. And also what's very interesting about this is where George and the horse used to stand. He was toppled into the river in a revolution at some stage. But what's interesting about all these images is how plain and simple and uncluttered the streets and the spaces are. This is just hogging on the North Mall with the limestone quays and the bollards that are still there, bollard railings I mean, and the white line on the edge of the footpath. And then on the left is Venice, and this is from McCurtain Street on the right, but you'll find this up around Wellington Road as well. There are remnants of all the flag that was used and the white limestone, and the same stones are very much used in Venice, but they haven't been pulled up in Venice as much as they have in Cork. So, we have to wonder why we keep renewing all the time rather than repairing. It's a very big question, but definitely the bollards on the edge of the Grand Parade were way better standard than the ones used in Venice. This is the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Michelangelo developed this in Renaissance times, and the buildings were not very well organised as he saw it, but he used that to advantage and created a false perspective and clad these original buildings and built a new building on the end. But the connection with the exchange in Cork is very obvious to me, and with Palladio's architecture, John Benson's architecture in the Athenaeum, and all of the expression of public buildings that you see the image brings you back to the Renaissance again. you can see the plan there. The building on the north part of the plan is a new building with a medieval building behind it, and I think the same on the left and on the right. You have an almost entirely new building, creating this false perspective. It's a very, very powerful space, and this tradition got to Ireland very fast. And here's the Crawford Gallery, which is expressing the Dutch classical tradition, and then on the left is Michelangelo's expression in the Capitoline Hill. I kind of prefer the one on the right. So, this is the Piazza Navona in Rome. It's basically a very large space with a Baroque fountain in the middle of it. I know it's a little bit more complex than that, but I show it for a particular reason. Here it is. It's almost as it was 500 years ago. You can see the level of the buildings, the level of the ordinary domestic buildings is very similar, and that's to do with technologies at the time and ability at the time. But there's a very simple code then. You have a church with a dome, which is of different scale and different material quality, and that's the code that we have employed in Cork also as part of this living, connected European tradition. But this is our space. This is our big classical space with our Baroque fountain in the middle of it, and something to me has been lost somewhere. We built a park next to it by knocking down all these medieval buildings, but we didn't realise that the space that we were creating and felt we needed was full of cars in this space right beside it at the time. And Tina will talk about space later on, but what we've done to this space, people ask me to do projects for them sometimes, and I go and I see them and I say, did you ever consider a declutterer first? And the point is well made here. Why are we filling up our space in this way? And then we have our connection with the water now, and that gentility in the city. This is an example of something that's been lost by levelling off the quays in front of the Merchants Quay Centre. But the handmade craftsmanship of this, the connection with the water and the memory of our ancestors as they went in and out of what was the arterial connection to the rest of the world. These are very significant things that we should not overlook. And of course, the quality of this construction just goes on and on and on. It's so good, it's so rare. We could not replace this now. We could never afford to replace it now. It's too good. It's too important. We think it's the longest Georgian intact waterway landscape in the world. And there it is, right in front of us. And I wish we were much, much more aware of it and using it in ways that would help to develop us as a society, and not just economically, but develop how we feel as people and all the great benefits that would give us. And we have nature. Here's our friend the heron, who seems to be in every photograph, and some Arabian daisies in the quay. I put these up. These are Darwin's finches. Now Darwin studied these finches in the Galapagos, and each one of them was slightly different from each other. And they had evolved that way to do what they necessarily needed to do in each of the different places that they were, but they were all connected and related. And it's a little bit like a series of cities in continental Europe. We're so connected, and yet each of one of us is specific in our own way and needs to remain specific. But it also talks about design. If you want to design something well, you have to understand all of the parameters and influences that will create something and then create a balanced object. If you don't do that, if you only concentrate on one function or another separate function, you will create grotesque things, and they will not be beautiful, because it's the balance of nature that creates beauty. And that can sometimes mean symmetry or not, or whatever, but that balance is what we as designers strive towards, to create good things. And every one of us deserves that high level of consideration in the public environment and in our cities in terms of how they change. But there's a city, a series of bird cities from the Galapagos, referencing all the cities of Europe that are connected from the 18th and 19th century. And so if you want to design something well in a historic place, you have to look to the people who are doing it well. And this is Sousa de Moro on the right in Portugal recently, and this is Carlos Scarpa on the left. And these are guys who don't really want to tell the world everything they know in everything they do. They've concentrated on one thing, done it well, and said, I'm going to be quiet because there's something else greater than me here. And I really admire that approach, and it's something we could learn from in Cork. And this is in Sweden. It's done by Caruso St. John, and they've literally recovered this entire square in Sweden with natural materials and natural cobbles, and they've returned a materiality to a place that had lost it in a very similar way that Cork has lost its materiality and its specific nature. And this is the Newport Street Gallery in London. I put it up just because someone said to me, so if you were to build a modern building in the historic centre of Cork, how would you do it? And here's an example of an old warehouse with a new building beside it. They're all integrated now, but this architect has decided to be modern, but also decided that he's going to be respectful, and that is a new way of thinking for architects, unfortunately and fortunately, and perhaps what we really need in the centre of Cork. This is almost my last slide. It's Borneo in Amsterdam, and plots were set up for people to develop their own homes. And development of new areas of cities doesn't always have to be office blocks one after the other. You can create spaces that allow people to do medium developments and enhance their lives. These people are not afraid to live beside the water, they're not afraid of the water, and they're also allowed to express themselves within a set of parameters and rules, which creates a richness that already reflects the kind of city that we have. So if we're to think about new developments and a new city in Docklands and whatever, there are much more complex ways in which that lead to the evolution of many different finches that we have to think about before we make those leaps. It's not just about the very big market with the people underneath. It's got to be about everybody. And this is a publication from the World Bank that says if you do it all that way, you'll reap the rewards socially and economically. So the World Bank agrees that historic places have got to be kept and looked after because they give advantages to cities that have them over the ones that don't. And there's George's Quay and the typical boat-fronted buildings in George's Quay reflected in the water, and that's the end of my talk on the specific nature of Cork. Thank you.